Thank you. I have chosen a future-oriented topic in line with the general theme of the conference, and if it becomes a little bit speculative at times, so be it. I want to start by outlining a fairly optimistic view of the state of the world. This is a graph of the number of armed conflicts in the period after World War II. The red area at the bottom, those are the interstate conflicts, and then the blue area, those are the internal conflicts. What we see is that there have always been relatively few interstate conflicts going on at the same time, but the number's been declining, and in recent years there have been no true interstate armed conflicts. The number of internal armed conflicts was increasing during most of the Cold War and a little beyond, but has fallen off sharply since about 1992. In the last few years, it's gone up a little bit again, but nothing to match the level of armed conflict that we saw right at the end of the Cold War. Now, of course, armed conflicts can be of greatly different sizes. So this is a figure for the severity of conflict measured by the number of battle deaths in different conflicts. And we see that this graph covers the 20th century and a little beyond. And what we see is that two conflicts, World War I and World War II, were completely dominant in terms of the severity of conflict in that period. They were so dominant that it's a little bit difficult to see what's going on after World War II. So if we enlarge that area, we now see is that the lethality of conflict is very dependent on individual wars. We see the first peak on the curve, that's the Chinese Civil War and the Korean War. The second peak is mainly the Vietnam War. The third peak is in part the Russian-Afghanistan conflict, and of course the Iran-Iraq war. The next peak is the Congo War, and then the Iraq War is out all the way out on the right-hand side. But the encouraging thing about this graph is that in spite of these ups and downs, the long-term trend is a decline in violence, decline in the lethality of conflict. Here's another indication of progress, perhaps. The growth of what you might call the liberal factors in world politics. The red line is the growth of international organizational membership. The yellow line is the growth of democratic government. And the blue line is the growth of globalization or economic integration as measured by trade as a share of the gross domestic product. The economic globalization, of course, has proceeded far more rapidly than the growth of international organization and the growth of democracy, but all these factors are pointing towards a world dominated more by liberal than by power politics factors. So the decline of violence may be related to the growth in the liberal factors in world politics. Now, despite this optimism, let me then introduce a note of pessimism, which relates to climate change, which has been perceived as a major threat by a number of commentators. The first two that I cite here are from a think tank report for the Pentagon in 2003. the next is a statement by 11 retired US generals and admirals who argued that climate change can act as a threat multiplier for instability in some of the most volatile regions of the world. The UN Security Council debated climate change as a security issue in April last year. I quote from the British Foreign Minister, who argued that the impact of climate change, such as crop failure and lingering droughts, sea level changes, and river basin degradation, go right to the heart of the security agenda. The former Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, said that climate change was an encompassing threat to peace and security. And the present Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, as well as the former head of humanitarian operations at the UN, Jan Egeland, identified Darfur as the first of many climate wars. And finally, the Norwegian Nobel Committee, in awarding the Nobel Peace Prize to the International Panel on Climate Change and to Al Gore, argued that climate change may induce large-scale migration and lead to greater competition for the Earth's resources, which may result in an increased danger of violent conflict and wars within and between states. So there's a great deal of pessimism attached to the security implications of climate change. What does the picture look like if we simply graph temperature changes and armed conflict? This is for the period 1946 to 1989, and if I had been a neo-Malthusian talking about this 20 years ago, I would have said, well, conflict is going up and the temperature is going up, so there must be some kind of relation. And if we look at the more recent period, of course, we see a reverse development. Conflict has been declining and the temperature keeps going up. Now, what does it show us? Well, in a sense, absolutely nothing. I mean, superimposing two time trends on each other is not going to give us a great deal of information. But unfortunately, much of the debate about social implications, including security implications of climate change, proceed on this fairly simplistic basis. But we need to go beyond that. So let's start with some of the physical consequences of climate change, which are reasonably well established. We see melting of glaciers and polar ice. We observe sea level rise. We see changes in precipitation. And we see some increased risk of natural hazards, floods, droughts, and hurricanes. What are the possible social consequences of climate change? Well, we may argue that there's a generally increased vulnerability to the physical environment. There's increased exposure to health hazards. There's destruction of some traditional livelihoods. Many indigenous people, for instance, are affected by this. There may be extensive environmental migration. And generally, there's a decrease in the predictability of human affairs. So it's not unreasonable, using an extended definition of security, to call this a security issue. And in that sense, the attention of the Security Council was warranted and was acknowledged as such by most of the countries that participated in the debate in the Security Council, with some reservations. But even though we recognize that climate change is a security issue in this wide definition, is it an important factor in future conflicts? Here I think there's a disconnect between the literature from the non-governmental organizations, between statements by politicians and think tank literature, and what you can find in the peer-reviewed academic literature. There are a number of studies from defense and environment agencies which tend to be fairly cautious and say that there may be some risk of armed conflict resulting from climate change without announcing this very definitively. If we look at the reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we find that in those reports, the statements that relate to natural science tend to be based on very, very extensive peer-reviewed research. Sometimes a single statement may be backed up by a dozen or even 100 studies. When it comes to the social implications, the link between the consequences of climate change are much more tenuous. And when it comes to conflict, which is not referred to very frequently in the IPCC reports, but there are some references, the sources are rather flimsy and scattered. The Stern Review on the economic consequences of climate change also hints at some implications for conflicts and has the same problems, that it relies on rather scattered and weak sources, generally not from peer-reviewed academic literature. But there is very little peer-reviewed research on this issue. So this is an important research agenda. What are some of the possible pathways between climate change and conflicts? The most obvious and perhaps most frequently publicized one is that sea level rise will force people to migrate, and this might lead to conflict in the areas that receive the migrants. Another or related scenario is that increased natural hazards such as drought, flooding, and hurricanes will lead to resource scarcity and resource competition and local conflicts. But it may also lead to migration out of the areas affected by the drought, and that gets us back into the first causal chain. A third possibility is that natural hazards may weaken the state, lead to lower state capacity, which will increase the opportunities for rebels who want to overthrow the state or to secede from it. With the partial exception of the last of these three causal chains, the whole idea of climate change leading to conflict is in a sense a strong version of the traditional neo-Malthusian model that resource scarcity relates to conflict. But there are a number of counter-arguments to these common conflict scenarios. First of all, the general link between resource scarcity and conflict is almost completely limited to single case studies. Statistical comparative analysis have not converged on any robust association between renewable resource scarcity and armed conflicts. And therefore, it is very difficult to predict to future situations where resource scarcity might lead to conflict, because such predictions are entirely dependent on the establishment of general relationships. When it comes specifically to the idea of migration leading to conflict in host areas, there is some research that indicates that migration is related to conflict, but it is quite plausible that this derives from what you might call importing conflict, because most or a great deal of migration is in fact conflict related. People flee away from conflicts, but they take the attitudes and the weapons and the organization with them into the host areas. It is not as obvious that environmental migration necessarily will lead to conflict. There is some analysis of disasters and conflict which suggests a connection, but this is mostly for geological disasters, and the mechanisms are not always clear. There are some exceptions, such as the Aceh conflict in Indonesia, which was not exacerbated by the tsunami 2 years ago, but in fact the tsunami, the natural disaster, led to a settlement of the conflict. In general, we can say that impending scarcities, resource scarcities, are very frequently handled by substitution, innovation, cooperation, and the use of market mechanism. So we see that in some areas where there's been fear of resource scarcity leading to conflict, such as in the case of freshwater, the academic literature has moved away from a water war scenario to a scenario of water cooperation, cooperating to solve the problem of scarcity rather than fighting over it. And climate change differs from some forms of environmental deterioration in that it's a fairly slow process, and this would point to the possibility of adaptation rather than conflict. Now, one concern has been that climate change might affect areas which already have so many problems that the climate change would exacerbate these problems. So one way of conceptualizing this is to look at the part of the world that the British economist Paul Collier has identified as the bottom billion. Collier's argument is that many developing countries are in fact doing quite well, but there are countries with about 1 billion people, 1/6 of the world, which suffer not only from low development, but also from a lack of growth. Now, Collier has not identified which countries these are, but we have used his criteria and created this map, which should be a rough approximation of his bottom billion. Now, what we would like to do in the future is to plot the effects of climate change onto this graph. Unfortunately, there's problems at the moment doing that, and this is because the climate change models are much more accurate for the parts of the world where there's good data collection, and that's generally in the north, and they're much less accurate for the parts of the world where climate change is likely to be more of a problem. So rather than trying to plot at the moment the effects of climate change in this graph, I'll plot the armed conflicts. And we can see that for Africa, there is a good bit of overlap between being in the bottom billion and being affected by conflict. But for the other armed conflicts going on, there's not actually that much overlap. Now, what are the priorities in the future research on climate change and conflict? I think the whole debate needs to be disaggregated, so rather than talking about the effects of climate change in general, we need to look at specific causal change, as I tried to do in an earlier graph. We need to couple the models of climate change to models of conflict to be much more specific about what level of sea level rise, for instance, may lead to what level of increased conflict. We also need much better data on various forms of violence. The graphs that I've shown here are generally limited to state-based conflicts between two organized parties, at least one of which is a state. But we also need much better data on one-sided violence, the violence of governments against unorganized groups, and non-state violence between groups where the government is not a party, which may be perhaps a more likely scenario for climate-related conflicts. These data need to be geo-referenced because at the moment data on conflict are measured at the national level, but in fact the effects may be subnational, and therefore we need to have much more detailed data. We need to look at the interactions between climate change and political and economic factors. Countries with robust institutions will be able to handle the effects of climate change better than countries with weak national institutions. We also need to balance the negative and positive effects of climate change. If you take an important issue, an important consequence like food production, obviously some countries which are affected by drought will, climate change will have negative effects on food production, but there are other countries where climate change may well lead to increased food production, and this country may be one of them. We need to integrate the consequences of climate change with other economic and social changes. And we also need to calculate the costs of reversing climate change versus mitigation. And finally, we need to focus on the most important consequences and not get lost in the myriad of possible consequences of these future scenarios. So what are my conclusions? Climate change is a major challenge to international relations, and it's a major challenge to the academic world as well as the policy world. Climate change is a security issue in the broad sense of the word, but there's little evidence to date that armed conflict is an important consequence of climate change. Now, this analysis does not depend, in a sense, on the causes of climate change. The focus of the debate is on human-induced climate change, but even nature-induced climate change could conceivably will also have consequences for the human habitation and possibly for conflict. Our countermeasures, however, depend very much on whether climate change is caused by human intervention or not. And the policy measures also depend on the consequences. In general, and this is of course a common conclusion for anyone engaged in research, more research is needed. More research on climate change and conflict is, I think, a priority issue. And I think it's important that the next round of assessment by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change should include a proper analysis of conflicts rather than the scattered comments that they have in the most recent report. Or alternatively, the Intergovernmental Panel should say that this is simply outside our area of competence and we leave that to others. Thank you.